Hello, I'm Sally Warhaft and welcome to Snapshot, our weekly discussion of the major issues concerning voters in the lead up to the federal election. With me in the studio is my co-panellist for these discussions, Tim Wilson from the Institute of Public Affairs. Good morning, Tim.
Good morning, Sally.
And also joining us today is our guest, the Greens Senate candidate for Victoria, Richard Di Natale. Thanks for joining us,
G'day,
Richard.
Sally.
Tim, it's been a big couple of days. What do you make of all the goings-on in the federal campaign?
Well, there's talk of Julia Gillard building some momentum in the campaign, but I think at this point it's probably only been a couple of days of momentum. There needs to be something more before we're actually going to see a shift, particularly if you look at the news poll today in The Australian, which shows that Labor is still well behind in the states they need to win government. But I think a particular interest, because we've got Richard here, is the role we're going to have with the Senate and the Greens playing in that after the election. Today, George Pell, the Archbishop of Sydney, has come out with some pretty scathing criticism of the Greens and its policies. Richard, how do you respond to that?
Well, I think we let our record respond to those sort of criticisms. It's disappointing. I mean, Archbishop Pell doesn't represent all Christians. We've got a great range of policies that I think Christian voters would be very sympathetic to. We've got a very compassionate and humane approach to the issue of refugees and asylum seekers, for example. On the issue of healthcare, which is an issue I've been campaigning on very hard, we've got policies that are really important, building the foundation around expanding the mental health budget, providing more for early intervention. They're issues that I think are based on the founding principle of Christianity, which is compassion, and it's a thread that runs right through the Greens policy platform.
Richard, we've ended up with Julia Gillard and Tony Abbott in this campaign. If the Greens had supported the government's ETS proposals, we would have been looking at an election most probably with Kevin Rudd and Malcolm Turnbull. How do you feel about that?
Well, essentially, we are guided by the policies that are put before us. The policy that was put before us, the emissions trading scheme, was a scheme that would have been worse than nothing. Australia's emissions would have risen under the scheme, risen significantly. We would have paid $20 billion in compensation for the privilege. But worst of all, what that scheme would have done would have locked in Australia's trajectory, which was an increase in emissions. What we've got now is we've got to look ahead. We've got to make sure that we look to the future. We've got the Greens that most analysts are saying will hold the balance of power in the next parliament.
But with two leaders who are seemingly nowhere near as committed to the topic of climate change as those two previous leaders.
And our job in the Senate is to make sure that they understand that the Australian people want real, lasting, genuine action on climate change. And it's why the Green vote continues to grow. Our vote's going from strength to strength because people do want action on climate change. In 2007, the Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd at the time, was elected with a very strong mandate to act. They squandered that mandate. It's now up to the next government, possibly a Gillard government, to work very closely with the Greens in the balance of power to make sure we get a price on carbon and we start taking the action that the country really wants us to take.
Richard, I'm glad you raised the role of the Greens in the Senate, because the reality is, if you look at all the opinion polls, and it's certainly the consensus amongst commentators, after the next election, Greens will control the balance of power in the Senate. And that basically means you're going to have a very strong influence on the policies of the government and what happens with those policies. What are your deal breakers going to be in the Senate in terms of policies you're going to want attached through to get for the government, whichever side it is, to get its legislation through?
We're going to deal with each piece of legislation on its merits. I think that's the key to being an effective balance of power party. You've got to deal with each piece of legislation that's put before you. You've got to be good at negotiating, and you've got to work hard to try and improve legislation as it comes before you. The idea of trading one piece of legislation against another piece is not good politics. I don't think Australian people want to see that. They want to see the Senate as a genuine house of review. They want all the legislation that's put before the Senate to be scrutinised and improved, and it's what we've done.
But doesn't that make all your policies that you're putting up now just a waste of time, because you're clearly not interested in enacting them in terms of trading them off for what the government's going to want to put through the Senate?
Not at all. I think it's really important that people understand when they elect a political party to an important position, like balance of power in the Senate, they know very clearly what they stand for. And people do know what the Greens stand for: strong action on climate change, much more compassion towards refugees, preventative health care, mental health, a well-funded public education system, and it goes on. Now, it's important that people understand that they're the values that we hold in that position, and we'll try and enact those values when legislation's put forward to us in the Senate.
So just to clarify, if Labor or Liberal want to get a particular version of the mining tax through, you're not going to say, well, you've got to pass the ETS or you've got to pass same-sex marriage. You're not going to trade any of that off.
We haven't done that in the past and we won't in the future. I mean, the example, for example, that's been brought up is the stimulus package. With the stimulus package, it wasn't the sort of package that the Greens would have designed. We would have made sure there was much more infrastructure spending in terms of green infrastructure, green jobs and so on. But we knew that Australia faced recession. We knew that without it, we were looking at double-digit unemployment. We improved it. We got $500 million worth of green jobs, community initiatives, and then we passed it. Now, if the Greens weren't in that role in the balance of power, the opposition would have blocked it. We would be in recession and we'd have double-digit unemployment right now.
What about issues, Richard, like a harm minimalisation approach for illicit drug users, which is something the Greens, and you certainly as a doctor, promote? I was talking to Malcolm Fraser a couple of weeks ago. He felt like the war on drugs, that it was inevitable that it was going to end. It really surprised me coming from him. Have the Greens got any hope of getting at least a non-hysterical discussion about these sorts of issues?
Well, Sally, as you said, it's an area I've worked in. I've worked in this area for a long time. It needs to be seen through the prism of a health problem, not a criminal one. We know that harm minimisation actually has tripartisan support. Both the old parties support harm minimisation as a concept. They just don't talk about it.
They kind of hide the needle exchange programs. And
exactly right. We've got needle and syringe exchange, which is a huge public health success story. In Australia, we've got a really good story to tell about the way HIV was prevented in this country among injecting drug users because we had needle and syringe exchange, something that was supported right across the board. It's just that in the context of election campaigns, people like using the old-fashioned tired slogans, war on drugs, that sort of nonsense. What we need to do is take the heat out of the debate, talk about it as a health problem, make sure that what we do is based on good science, good evidence.
Is that going to be possible in the current political culture, though?
Well, that's one thing you get when you vote for the Greens, is you get a responsible, pragmatic, common sense voice on these sorts of issues. It's an area I'm very passionate about. Having balance of power gives you an opportunity to change the debate a little, gives you an opportunity to maybe push issues that might not otherwise be popular. And so it's certainly something that I'll be working towards if elected.
Well, there's been a lot of commentary recently about how the Greens have mainstreamed over the past few years and ditched policies like legalising currently illegal drugs. So are you suggesting that the old Greens were not a mainstream party and you've come up to some sort of new, responsible agenda?
Well, what's actually happened, Tim, is that Australians are recognising our policies as common sense, good, forward-thinking policies, and they're moving towards us. We haven't actually watered down our agenda at all. We've always been talking about harm minimisation. We've spoken about compassion towards refugees.
There's no argument about that.
What we've done is we've made sure that everything we do is based on good science, good evidence. And I mean, what's really happening in the Australian community is people are now understanding what the Greens stand for, the values that we hold, and there's a massive void at the moment. You've got two political parties so focused on personality, on sort of style over substance. It's almost been a policy-free zone, this election. And then you've got the Greens who are setting the agenda on a number of national issues. For example, high-speed rail. We proposed that 3 months ago. It was voted down by the old parties, and yet now we've got both the major parties jumping on board, pardon the pun, but it's a positive thing. It's a good thing that the Greens are setting the agenda. We're quite happy for the old parties to take our policies. And we also recognise more and more so that Australians are seeing the Greens as a really viable alternative.
That void, though, puts a lot of pressure on the Greens, particularly, I think, Adam Bandt in Melbourne. If he doesn't win that seat for the Greens this time, it's hard to imagine there is ever going to be a better time for the Greens to take a lower house seat, and the expectations are really big. How will you feel, if he doesn't do that? What's the future for the Greens if Adam Bandt can't take that seat and the Greens don't live up to the expectations?
It's a good question. Of course, I'd be disappointed, no question about that. But I've got to say, I've heard that analysis and commentary over the past 10 years in each election I've been involved with. The Green vote's peaked, things aren't going to get any better, it's just a protest vote.
But the dumping of a climate change policy that the Australian people voted for 3 years ago, we've never seen that before. The Greens have never seen that before.
Sure, but what never fails to amaze me is just how the capacity of the old parties to disappoint the Australian community. It happens election after election after election. Our vote's gone from 2 to 4 to 6 to 8 to 10%. It just keeps growing slowly. And I think it'll continue to grow until one of the old parties decides to embrace our vision for the future. Now, of course, it'll be disappointing if Adam doesn't win it, but that's not going to make or break the future for the Greens. I think what you'll see is us continue to campaign. The work that he's done there will build a really strong basis for the next election campaign and beyond.
It's interesting you say that because the Greens have a history of recycling candidates. If you take the Green spirit into the way you operate yourselves, because you yourself have run for a seat in the past, the state seat of Melbourne. Adam Bant has previously run under the Green banner before. Are we going to see new candidates actually coming through the Greens, or is it just going to be the continual recycling of candidates who have been unsuccessful till they get a gig?
Well, we've got 37 candidates, for example, here in Victoria contesting lower house seats, right across the spectrum, young people, older people, people from different backgrounds. It's also important, though, that people get to understand, particularly in those important seats like Melbourne and in the Victorian Senate, what their candidates stand for, who they are, and to build a bit of trust and a relationship with them. And that's why Adam and myself have been candidates on successive occasions. It's not unusual. It's not something that's new to the Greens.
Richard, we're going to have to wind it up there. We've run out of time already, but can we thank our guest, Richard Di Natale? Thank you so much for joining us, and Tim Wilson. And we'll be back next week for our last snapshot before the election.
The brand new show that's turning sport on its head.
Hello, welcome to Contact Sport. I'm Paul Kennedy.
Stay in touch with all